So, as I was saying, since there are people here who are new to Racket and may not know where it comes from, I'm going to start out trying to tell you, who probably built the tower and where the egg came from and all those things. As Matthias said, it started when we were in Houston. He was the professor, Robbie and Sriram and I were the grad students, and Matthias had this idea for how to design programs, and Racket came out of that. Right? And we graduated and spread out across the country. Meanwhile, there was this guy, Eli Barzilai, up in Cornell, who was doing a dissertation on something, but just started doing Racket all the time instead. Right? So he got involved pretty early. Then Matthias moved. So around 2000, this is kind of what the picture looked like. We had specialized at this point. So I work on the runtime system and the macro system. Robbie is the main person responsible for Dr. Racket. So when you start up Dr. Racket, you're seeing his work, and also the contract systems, which we've already heard a bunch about that. Sriram has been mainly exploring ideas in the neighborhood of Racket and pushing in different directions there. Ellie did a lot of things, a lot of libraries, but especially the infrastructure to get Racket out and all of the mailing list and everything that has to be done. And Matthias still with ideas, and as will become clear from the slide as it gets crowded up there on the upper right, producing people, producing more Racketeers. So this is we spread out. We started teaching more students. So Ryan and Sam and Jay came along. Jay worked on the web server and lately on the new package system. Right? Ryan did the macro stepper and more recently the database libraries. And Sam is, of course, typed Racket. And they graduated and moved on. And there's another round of students. Right? And other people that come in through sort of the academic system. And I've way oversimplified in my history, right? John and Kathy were around from almost the beginning in Houston and so on. And this is, still quite an oversimplification. This is a lot of the main people who are still active. But when we fill in all the students who have come through and made, many pieces of the painting, right? There's a lot of us here. And one thing we like to do to sort of recognize the work that they do, they do some academic work and they publish papers and they get a dissertation, but for their contributions to Racket, we like to give out shares of the company. There is a PLT Design Incorporated. So that's what I'd like to do now. We have three of the people here. Neil Toronto, come on up, and Stephen Chang, and James Swain. So we have for them, they get certificates that look like this. That's a little piece of PLT design. So, see, I thought I would have two hands for this. So, there you go. I think that's Stephen, Neil, and James. Thanks. You can sit down. So this is a very university academia-dominated picture, right? That's part of where we come from. But it's not even close to the whole picture, right? And I've just put some dots on places where I know there are long-term projects, long-term contributors, and just the ones that I sort of knew off the top of my head. So this is, again, pretty incomplete. And a lot of people have been involved for a long time, but this year we have three new people that we'd like to appreciate and hand out shares of the company. Jan Axel Sugo in Denmark there. Greg Hendershot is here. So come on up, Greg. And Eric Dobson, who's not here also. So we'd like to thank those three people and have a similar certificate for Greg. Okay, so now you know a few of the faces. I'm sure you memorized that slide with 40 people before. That's one way of looking at Racket history. Here is a more, development-oriented, what the picture looked like. So if we started in 95, then for a long time it was just about taking Scheme as this nice academic language and combining it with lots of libraries to make it practical. Right? And then the module and the macro system came along when the language and the libraries grew to a certain point where we needed those things to manage it. And then in the mid-2000s was a bunch of work towards performance, right? Because we had enough things that it mattered at that point. And then we realized that we had this big pile of stuff that people didn't understand, so we had a real push on documentation and getting the word out. Right? And of course, the name change to Racket came inside somewhere there. And then most recently, the big push has been on packages and more generally sort of breaking Racket up instead of the big monolithic distribution into a lot more pieces. So not only making it easier for other people to contribute and sort of be at the same level that the built-in stuff is, but also breaking out the built-in stuff. And that's kind of a work in progress still. There's a lot now that you can use, but we still have some more work to break things up. So since that's kind of new, and since there's a facet of this that, as I've observed and talked to people, there's a certain part of it that people don't understand well yet, I'm going to just take some time to talk about packages. So if you want to know about packages, then you go to packagesracketlang.org, and you get this big list of things, and you have the package name there and the author's or brief description. And then if there's documentation that can be built by the build system, then that gets linked in there too. Right? So that's what it looks like to use it. You just go into Dr. Racket and say install a package, and you use that name in the first column or on the command line, racco package install. Right? So there's plenty of documentation on that or people who can help you. That's not so much the level I want to talk about. Let's back up a little bit and just talk about libraries. So suppose you have a fish library in some aquarium folder, or AQ for short. Right? And of course you want to use this fish library in your program, right? Which is somewhere else on your file system. So how do you refer from main to fish? Well, as long as that AQ folder is in collects, the designated main collection folder, right? That's kind of the simplest way to do things. Then you can just say AQ/fish. That means the AQ collection and the fish module in there, right? So how should we deal with packages? And one way is there is some web of packages out there. And so what you do is write something that refers to one of those packages out in the world. And that's a sensible way to do things, and that's kind of the way we did it first. You end up having to talk about sort of the author and the particular package and some versions, and then there's some version constraint matching that goes on. Right? So this approach has some advantages in that it kind of is an obvious generalization. You just point to something out in the web. There's a sensible versioning notion built in, but there's some disadvantages too that have to do with how the package actually gets downloaded and installed, and whether you should be really referring to a specific instance of an interface that you mean, something like Aquarium. So another way to go about this is, of course, you have packages out there and you break out the installation step from the reference step. So the way it works is if you want the Aquarium package, you install it using, as I just mentioned, racco package install or in Dr. Racket. And what that does is just unpack everything into an Aquarium folder, puts it under collects, and then once it's there, you refer to it just like you would any other. And in fact, this you don't really have to use racco package install to install a package necessarily. You could use any of your tools that you have for taking archives and putting it locally into a folder. Maybe using Git, that's a common way to do things. If you had to put it under collects, that might be inconvenient. You want it to be in your own local directory somewhere. So then what you do is, however you ended up with an Aquarium folder, you can say racco package install AQ/, that makes it a directory path. And so then what happens is AQ is kind of registered as a collection. Conceptually, it's put in the collections directory, but it's not actually moved. There's just kind of a link set up so that the module system knows where to find it. With me so far? All right. So I've oversimplified here a little bit, because this picture is more what happens if you say something like racco package install and you put a URL there, because then you're referring to a specific, pile of code that is pulled directly off and installed locally. But that's not what you usually do. What you usually do is racco package install Aquarium. So now I'm going to talk about catalogs, which is this intermediate step, which is a more interesting step than you might think offhand. Right? So if you say racco package install AQ, then it goes and consults the catalog, and the catalog says AQ currently means that zip file over there. Right? And then, of course, the mapping in the catalog can change, or that resolution looks bad. Oh. Again, that's straightforward, right? So you can imagine having multiple catalogs and consulting them in order until you find the first match. And that's exactly what happens. And in fact, when you download an installation for Racket, like 6.1, when you download the installer and run it, it is pre-configured with 2 paths. So first, it'll go look at the release-specific catalog. And then when it doesn't find there, then it'll fall back to packages racketlang.org. So what this lets us do is decide that certain packages really should be frozen with the version 6.1. And so when you ask for those packages, they're found in that first place, while at the same time we can have new packages appear at packages racketlang.org. And it's not just a special thing for distributions, and this is kind of the point I wanted to get to, which is that you can make your own catalogs and have your own rules for how these package names that you request get translated into specific implementations. In particular, you notice that when I say install aquarium, there's nothing about a version number there or a package author and so on. And instead, those kind of questions are deferred to the catalog. And if you want to take control over those questions, then what you do is you make your own catalog. And then we provide tools to make that easier. So there's Racco package catalog copy, which you point it at a catalog, and it just makes a shallow copy of that catalog. Just sort of photocopies the book. All the entries in the book are still pointing to what they were. So if you do that for packages racketlang.org, for example, you take a snapshot of all the references to the packages, and that way if new packages are appearing and you're updating multiple machines, you can get a kind of consistent set of packages that way. That's just a shallow copy, and that's going to work for most things where packages are implemented, where the sources are GitHub repositories, right, where all the old versions are going to be there, so they won't disappear on you as they update. But if that's not good enough, then there's another tool called Racco Package Catalog Archive, which does this deeper copy. Copies the catalog, but also copies all the individual packages to one place there. And then you're sort of taking a snapshot of the world. And that might be appropriate for some part of your development process or your testing and distribution process. And there's nothing special really about these Racco package commands. They're just sort of built-in convenience things, but there's a package library that gives you control over all the fine details. These catalogs can be implemented in a couple of ways. They can be a SQL database, SQLite database. They can just be a directory with files in it, and there's APIs for manipulating those. So when it comes to questions like, how do I deal with, I have this kind of version constraint and I want these kinds of things and these kinds to not change, the answer is make your own catalog and manipulate the mapping in the catalog to do those things. Okay. Any questions on this point so far? I have one more step, but yeah. Yeah, the security is to be the next step. So we believe, Jay believes, he's designed this in such a way that we can add on, start using HTTPS and those kinds of things. I meant to go read the paper about package systems and security before today, and I forgot, but we'll go read that and find out what we're supposed to do. We're pretty sure we can layer something good on top of this. Okay. That's great. Yes?
When you do this catalog archive, is that something that every old version of every package?
No, it's just getting the current source. Yeah. Yes, if you want the really clear official answer, you ask the designer, Jay. So there are no old versions. And I'm about to tell you why that's not true, but it's not his fault. Okay. So a catalog then just maps a package name, like AQ, to a package source that is an actual implementation, HTTP, GitHub, something like that. Okay. Then, a GitHub reference can be like this, where there's sort of a second piece of information that is the commit, or it can have a hash something, whether something is a branch or a tag or something like that. So there's various ways, quite a few ways of representing a source, and it's all about sort of making the developer's view of things the same as the user's view. It's all directories that are plugged into the collection. Okay, so then suppose we're in this world where there's a 6.0 user and the 6.1 user and someone at some company that has very specific policies on the packages they want to use. They all have their own catalogs. That's great. They get control over that dimension of it. But now we have a new developer, or a developer with a new package. Right? Where do they put that so that everyone can use it? Right? Because now there's all these other packages, all these other catalogs, right? Because maybe they want control over a subset of things, but still want to be able to see new packages as they come out. Right? So part of the answer is each of these users may decide to consult multiple catalogs, where the second one is packages Racket lang. So far, so good. So all users now see this new package, can conveniently access it. But what if this package relies on some 6.1 specific feature? Or to run right in 6.0, it needs something. So there's a story on dependencies that are checked when you install to make sure it's sane, and maybe this package just isn't sane for 6. Right? So then what do you do? Right? So this is kind of a classic extensibility problem where you have two different dimensions, you want to have different versions, but you also want to be able to add new packages. So what we've done for now is that packages actually can answer questions that combine a particular package name with a version number. So this user's catalog consultation, when it asks, it'll say for 6.0, and this one will say for 6.1. And this author here in green can decide to point requests to different places. So I mention this again because this is something that's relevant to all of us making packages, right? If you want to make packages that sort of deal with different versioning constraints or different requirement constraints, that's how you can do it. Whether this is a good idea or whether we should have separate catalogs, I think remains to be seen. So that's sort of the point where we are now. And actually right now, these requests are always version numbers, but I think there's no reason we could just generalize it to be more things probably. So that's where we are. Any other questions on packages? Right? So the whole point was just to say catalogs exist. If you have a question on how something might be done, the catalogs might be the answer. Yes? Okay, so the question is, you install 6.0, you do a bunch of packages, you upgrade to 6.1, and now you don't see your packages anymore. That was a specific choice we made. So all your 6.0 packages are still there. And actually, there's a migrate tool in Dr. Racket. So if you go into the GUI, there's a migrate and say, hey, I know about 6.0. Do you want me to reinstall those packages? It'll go fetch them again, but it can at least help you migrate. Other ways to do things have to do with giving a name to your installation, and then it'll go in a user-specific space, but under the name, so that when you upgrade, it'll rebuild them without downloading. So again, there's a bunch of little pieces. We tried to do the thing that was least dangerous for the typical user, and not mixing version numbers was the least versions was the least dangerous thing. But as you can imagine, there are 5 different levels of things you can configure. Any other question? Yep. Yeah, okay. Okay, so what if you have 2 libraries that depend on a third library, and they have different requirements, different versions of that library? So we're taking so far we're not trying to solve that technically, we're trying to solve it socially. So if it's sort of both of those things, all those packages are supposed to be the latest package, then we hope that those authors have a conversation and make things all work in sync. When that's not an option, well, catalogs. If there's no possible combination of libraries that can work, like there just don't exist versions of the first 2 that work with a particular version of the second one, then something has to change. And I guess I'll throw in that another part of Jay's design here, I think, is aimed at empowering you to make those changes instead of being stuck on whoever maintained the library originally, so that things can be fixed through social processes. Right. So there's not a crisp answer of the form. You can install both and it'll work. No. Well, so you can get, yeah, we considered it. Yes. So the reason, I'll just say a little bit meta now. The reason there are so many package systems out there with slightly different trade-offs is the same reason there are so many different programming languages. It's really you choose one thing here and it has benefits or drawbacks over there. So we're all choosing different things, and that's part of the reason there are so many. So our particular choices don't try to deal with two different libraries, whether it's two different versions of two different packages, two different versions of a package that conflict, or two different packages that conflict. We just say, nope, go fix it. So the question is, under a collects directory, install two different versions. If you change the packages so they define two different collection names, two different library paths, then you can do that. But the conflict that I was talking about is if they define the same collection and the same modules inside there, then the package system will say, no, this doesn't work. Yeah, we may well. So yes, the statement was in Python, that's what they did, and it caused lots of problems. And it's just hard to say that for sure we'll see the same thing because there are so many little details that are different, and they place you on slightly different points in the spectrum. Right? So yeah, so the question is, how scalable is it? Because it's just a flat namespace with typically short names. This might be a problem, but again, that's where we opted for a social solution rather than a technical solution. Why there's a packages.racketlang.org. We know there are trade-offs there, but we're going to try this because we've seen the negative problems that happen with the other way of doing the more hierarchical things. Is that have I said anything wrong so far, Jay?
You're reaching the true doctor.
All right. Thanks. So yeah, just for these multi-purpose catalogs like packages.lang, .racketlang.org, that just means that the query comes in with a package name and something about your environment. Okay, so that was about packages and sort of where we are. Now I'd like to sort of just say a little bit about what I think we're doing next, and then open it up to more questions, particularly more general questions. So this is kind of the view from the bottom of what the world looks like. From me squashed under here, there's this giant runtime, and then there's some libraries up there. Okay. And the runtime inside of it, you saw it was colored in C code. This is still C, it's just C with the garbage collector. This is too much C. Obviously, we like Racket code a lot more. And so the current, right now, like Monday, like tomorrow, no, Monday's the day after tomorrow, is, starting to rewrite the macro expander in Racket, of course, sort of lift that out of the core and make the core smaller. And then the compiler is either next or in parallel. And then there's all sorts of primitives that are built into the core that made sense as primitives when we just had an interpreter. But now that we have a compiler, then it certainly makes sense to pull those out. So that's, somewhere between a week and a year or a decade's worth of work. But if I had to guess, and I do have to guess, I'm going to say about a year. So that's what the kind of things that we expect to happen over the next year. And it's aimed not just at getting rid of the C code, but also making the whole runtime system more nimble or replaceable, right? That we can run on JavaScript or run on JVM or something like that. Right? So the more we move out to Racket, the less we have to sort of replicate for different environments. Right? I'll point out that we've already sort of shrank things with the package system. Right now, it's possible to download a small Racket, small and then 1/10 the size of the regular distribution, and you can get a Dr. Racket that's sort of in between the whole distribution, and so on. So we're just sort of continuing that trend, pushing deeper and deeper down. Meanwhile, there's typed Racket. Actually, some of the libraries are written in typed Racket, not Racket. So another thing that you'll see is that more and more of the libraries that are sort of close to the core things that you build on will themselves be in typed Racket. Right? We'd like to push in that direction. In fact, we'd like the compiler and macro expander. Obviously, typed languages are very good at helping you write compilers. So something like that should happen, but that you can see my picture doesn't work anymore. There's some sort of bootstrapping problem in there that we'll have to solve. So that might be the next year. I don't know. And when I sort of gave you this view, again, kind of from the bottom of what's happened over Racket, and I said there were these things that we concentrated on at different periods, but it's also cumulative, right? It's not that we just did this one thing and just the next thing. Every time we started focusing more on performance, then of course that carries through. And so we're just going to do all of these things still. And in the configurable one, I still think of this breaking pieces out of the runtime system as being in that configurable vein. Somewhere down the line, there will be something hashlang Racket 2, right? As Matthias alluded to. It was Matthias, right? I started talking about that before. Whether it will be called Racket 2, I don't know. What kinds of things will it have? I don't know exactly. We're pretty sure that we're going to make things more uniform and have more functional data structures built in, just copying what we learned from Clojure. We're pretty sure that... what else are we sure about? Parentheses? Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure about those at all. Despite what I may have said 3 years ago, don't go back and look. Yeah, so you can ask or suggest on that if you have particular things. So you can tell I'm kind of running out of steam. You can always ask for more questions. If the questions get too hard, then I have my magic 8-ball to answer the questions for me. So, any more questions? Right. Oh wait, this is where you're supposed to use the microphone, right? So I might as well just walk around.
For those of us who have some favorite libraries that are still in Planet, is the plan to just continue with the automatic translation? Should we, if nobody's working on those right now, should we go ahead and pick those up and convert them to packages, or what would you suggest?
Yeah, great question. If you use a library that's in Planet, move it to the new package banner, sort of take control of it. And that would be great to see that happen. Oh, yeah, but if it's someone who you know is reasonably active, or even not, it's a good idea to ask them about it. Yeah. Any other question?
You alluded to the Racket 2 thing in the future. Do you see that more as there are things that you now feel like were mistakes in the past that you want to correct? Or is it more like we have these great new ideas that we want to push out?
I'd say it's a combination. We want to sort of do house cleaning. We know better ways to do certain things. Just to toss out a very concrete example, making structs opaque by default was the wrong choice. They should be transparent by default, maybe even prefab by default. And again, that's maybe something we learned through Clojure via Python and so on. So those kinds of changes or cleanups are correcting mistakes. But something that only sort of half fits in that category is we now know a lot more where we're going in a variety of pieces. We can make it more uniform. Have things that, I don't know, I always worry about using the word orthogonal, but more orthogonal and more generic pieces. Yes?
Would this be an appropriate time to ask about where you want to go as far as the growth of Racket?
So you mean how many users do we want to have, or something like that? A few more users always helps, right? I'm aware that we don't necessarily want millions of users because you get boxed in various ways that way. On the other hand, one of my hopes is that we don't get boxed in the way some languages have, because we have this hashlang mechanism. We can always introduce hashlang Racket 2 and still have hashlang Racket. Now, there are some cases where that hasn't quite worked, and the two are immutable pairs and the recent change to undefined. But I think our experience is we've kind of whittled it down. Undefined, we worried about undefined, like would people put up with this backwards incompatible change? And no one objected, and the world has worked just fine. It's just been a pure positive. So I'm optimistic, but we'll see how this plays out. So yeah, we want more users.
This is maybe more general for Racket too. Brooks talked about the second system effect. Do you have any concerns about that, or?
No, because we're on system 6 or 7 or something by now. So, I mean, for me, my biggest second system was the GUI library when I rewrote it in Racket instead of C++, and we pulled it off. So, I think we can do it. Other questions? I like this walking around like a talk show host.
You mentioned a couple of examples about changing like structs to transparent prefab, and then you were talking about the change to undefined. Could we just move Racket slowly, incompatible change by incompatible change, into the future?
As necessary, but I'm hoping that there's fewer and fewer incompatible changes, or they're more and more in the corners. So yeah, I think mostly what we do is we just define new languages while keeping the old ones. A lot of my, open paren module mizscheme programs still work, and I still use them. I know that doesn't hold for all of them, but it's something we keep in mind, balancing backward compatibility. Not only do we keep it in mind, balancing backward compatibility with future improvements, but we try to set it up so that we can do that even more. You know what I mean, I think.